Did you know that Hong Kong has more skyscrapers than any other city in the world and that China builds more skyscrapers each year than any other country? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about China with writer and podcaster Jason Szeftel on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore the politics and economics of China with Jason Szeftel. But first, a trivia question. How many time zones does China have? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Jason Szeftel on the show today. Jason is a China specialist who writes and speaks on the politics and economics of China. In his podcast, China Unraveled, he covers in depth the complexities of Hong Kong and other issues China faces today. When I learned about Jason's deep understanding of China, my curiosity was immediately piqued and I wanted to learn more. I hope this interview with Jason will spark your curiosity too. Welcome to the show, Jason. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Karen. I'm really excited to be on.
What's the most important thing that I should know about you?
Well, I guess basically a person who helps people understand about China, where it comes from, the interesting stories going on in its history and its past, it's sort of what's happening, how it modernized the way it did, where things are going, and how to interpret some of the events that we see, whether it's regulations on video games or crackdowns on tech industries or kind of the stuff that's going on. I try and translate it from Western audiences that are justifiably and understandably confused and concerned about what's going on.
And what got you interested in studying China?
Well, I've been interested forever. Actually, I have a brother who has autism, and I had basically a Chinese guy in my house since I was 0. Like before I was born, this person Chinese in and out all my life, and because he was helping him with all of his issues. And then I've been interested, I'd say the actual interest probably goes back 15, 20 years. Around 9/11 is actually when it started, I guess 20 years. I was very concerned with the United States running around with all of its misadventures in the Middle East and all the chaos that was resulting from it. And then in the background, we had a country like China, which was so much older, so much more complex, so much more, in many ways, imposing and powerful. And I was just curious. And then, of course, I've been interested. I've read the old literature. I learned the Chinese language. I actually got a scholarship to study in China. I was in Beijing and I moved. It just kind of expanded from there. But it's old. It's a really old, like some people are like, what? That sounds like when you were 5 years old. I'm like, well, kind of. It's definitely a very old childhood interest that just expanded over the years. And all the places I've been, things I've learned have just kind of just continually gotten pulled in like a whirlpool into the sort of China theme.
How long did you study in China?
I was there. So I was in and out of China between 2010 and 2015. First time was 2011 and then it's 2013. And then I was actually going to be back in 2017, but things kind of got weird there. And sort of the stuff I talk about, people I know, that kind of stuff, it wasn't right. And so I was actually in South America. But yeah, I mean, many months I was in China.
And what are some of the major differences between the US and China?
Well, I think a really important thing that seems good we all see on the surface is there's very much I would say collectivist, I don't want to associate it with sort of Marxism or any criticisms of it or in that way, but there's a deeply collectivist strain in China that really relates back to its history of struggling to come together as a nation and to deal with really profound challenges to governance and administration, and the need to bring people together, whether it's to build giant great walls, build rivers, build cities, defend against barbarian attacks, try and consolidate the culture in China. All of these things required a very deep and committed people who really want to be seen as a people, not so much individuals in the way we see today. And so that really comes out today. We're seeing the equivalent of the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks of China getting slapped down and being told, hey, you're part of the collective. You're part of the modernization of the Chinese nation. And it's a great way to see what's going on. Here, we're like, oh my God, Bezos is taking over the world. And Elon Musk is going to go to the moon first. It's all crazy. There, all the major tech entrepreneur, billionaire, inspiring figures in this sort of business context, they're all being told to toe the line. They all are. It's a very big, very, very big difference. And here we have more of this individualist strain, which you can get to in very ways, but it's very, very different. And it goes much deeper than we expect. It's not just these sort of surface things.
And you've stated that China's past is much darker and more chaotic than it seems. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So Chinese history is, we look at it and we see, oh, wow. Well, they say 5,000 years of history. And being generous, they'll say it's more like 4,000. That's a very generous one. 5,000 is a propaganda term. That's pretty old. But so 4,000 years of history. And if you look at it, it looks like, wow, impressive dynasty after impressive dynasty. But when you really drill down, you'll see that the length of every single dynasty is exaggerated and extended to maintain an impression of order and unity as far back into history as possible. But just to give an example, if you added up all of the Chinese dynasties, even the official numbers of how long they lasted, all of them together, and you added, okay, how long has China been around? It's actually less than ancient Egypt just before China even really got started. From like the 4th century BC, 4th millennium BC, the 2nd millennium, there's an integrated unity and purpose that ancient Egypt had for various reasons that China, in all of its history afterwards, never reached. So it's a very, very different thing. And what you really see on the ground in China is massive wars. So for example, the Chinese state really came together with the Qin dynasty. It was 221 BC. It was the 3rd millennium, 3rd century of the 1st millennium BC. And that really is the right time to say this is the first Chinese empire. There's a lot of good reasons for that. And before then, there's many phrases and literary almost phrases for what they described as the spring and autumn period. There's the warring states, there's this and that. But what it really was at least 500 years of unrelenting, bloody violence and civil war, 500 straight years. And so this is the time in history when you get Sun Tzu's Art of War. This is when you get a whole, and this is when the original Kung Fu variations, the various Chinese martial disciplines all developed, because it's directly related to the primary political and philosophical question of the time, which was, how do we end the violence? And that is what the Chinese state originally was designed to do. But this bloody violence, I'm sorry to make it sound kind of gruesome, it just returns. And that's the tragedy in many ways of Chinese history, where it just comes back. So there's many periods of Chinese history that are warlords. It's just warlords. It's just warlords fighting it out. And the most recent one was after the end of the Qing dynasty. That was basically 1911. That was the last Chinese dynasty, official sort of dynasty. And there was supposed to be, it was a very inspiring and sort of transformational moment. It was supposed to be the beginning of modernization for very old people. And there was Sun Yat-sen. This was before Mao. This was before all this. It was before it all split into the many camps that happened later on. But what you really saw, instead of forming a republic and evolving into something else, what really happened was the Qing state devolved, and all the little pieces spun out of the massive Qing state, and little warlords formed in the old regions they always form in, and then they duked it out for decades. And then obviously the Japanese came and there was colonization. But this phase that you see of basically Chinese state coming together, massively powerful state, no way this could ever end, no way, and then it always crumbles into pieces. And all these pieces have warred, these same pieces of China have warred against each other we're talking 3,000 years. And what the Chinese state since 1949, the communist state, has been trying to do is trying to use all the tools of the modern world, of modern science and technology, modern industrial technologies, now digital and data-driven means, to try and get at the root and remove these foundational challenges that it's had that always seem to cause it to splinter into pieces. And it's a very, very old pattern, and there's really deep roots about why it is the way it is. And that is really what the Chinese state is after. So when we're looking at what's going on in China and like, what are they worried about? Why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? Most of the time, yes, there's this, every great state wants to be global dominant sort of country or whatever, but really they're worried about chaos within the country. They spend more on controlling their own people. Literally, they spend more on internal security than on external defense. That means more on making sure the Chinese people don't rebel than on trying to fight the United States or Japan or Taiwan or any of that, which is a very striking thing. And that's what we saw with COVID. When you saw the initial lockdowns in February and March of 2020, those were not a public health. It was a public health measure, but it was using the resources that have been developed within China particularly the last 15 years for a public health means, but it was those were internal security resources, this whole grid system, all of these, it was very remarkable in a lot of ways. But what we saw was really the mobilization of what China has built to try and prevent, like I was saying, that fragmenting of the country.
Do you think there's another country today that has that type of issue where they're spending more of their resources to control their own people than they are to worry about external defense? Maybe North Korea, I don't know. Can you think of another country where that seems to be the case?
The problem with China is that it just has so many people, and that really is what raises the cost so much. And there's so many different regions, there's so many different geographies, there's so many different languages and ethnicities actually in China. That's a big reason why they have these costs. There's Uyghurs, and it's so varied, it's so large and complex that it really adds these costs. And I mean, another country, I mean, it's really hard to do that because most countries don't have the state capacity to try. So they wouldn't succeed in the first place. China both has these immense challenges, and it always produces these insane states, which is 220, I mean, basically 2,500-ish years of bureaucratic administrative governance. And it really doesn't matter if it's a communist state or any sort of Chinese state, they would develop this sort of massive state we saw. And most countries can't do it. I mean, countries like Russia don't have the capacity in the same way. Russia's been trying to regulate its internet, like China has with the Great Firewall, that kind of stuff, for like 6 years at this point. No success. It just doesn't have that same level of capacity. And yeah, I think Brazil, I mean, you're looking at the large countries. There's only 5 or 6 really large ones. Brazil can't do it. India is fragmented, has a sort of federalist system. It doesn't really quite need to in the same way. It hived off the Bangladeshi and Pakistani elements, which are more Muslim, which perhaps could have required something like this. But you just do not see it at this scale. There's smaller countries maybe that I don't know as much about, like some maybe an African country or something in Eastern Europe, but the scale is immense in China.
It sounds like you're saying that they're a very collectivist culture, but at the same time, they're not maybe as unified as other countries because they have so many different factions of people that they're trying to bring together under one government.
Yeah, so the collectivism stems from the fragility, the difficulty of achieving unity. This is where it comes from. It's a desperate, it's an imperial impulse originally to try and say, if we don't have an empire, if we don't actually, so the Chinese empire, historically, the empire part of the empire, doesn't come from conquering other places. It comes from conquering the different pieces of China. That's actually, well, I mean, that's why there was an empire before it went anywhere else. And historically, China doesn't really go many places except for Southeast Asia and sort of more of the steppe region in Central Asia and sort of modern Russia. It doesn't really go many other places. It has its hands full in China. And you're definitely right that the collectivism does come from this very fragile unity you see in China, which is it's funny. There's so ironic because it looks so powerful, looks so strong, and you see it. But remember, I mean, it's sort of like a very, I mean, to use like a sort of personal and metaphor, like so you see these sort of guys who are enormous, they're giant, they have enormous muscles, and they're tyrannical for their like daughters or whatever. It's like I don't know if this dude really has, because he feels so strong as he, you know what I mean? It's a similar.
Well, it's perhaps a lot of the image that they want us to see rather than the reality of what is actually happening.
Definitely. And in China, another good thing people should always keep in mind is the same way a lot of the money for defense is spent internally, a lot of the propaganda is internal as well. They want their own people to see the Chinese government looking large and in charge. Do you know what I mean? It's a very similar process where, and even there's this whole thing going on where the Chinese diplomatic corps was on the offensive and like going up butting heads with like Canada and Australia and France, everyone. And a lot of this was, again, it was an internal, they wanted the people to see a sort of nationalistic, powerful China not being stepped on by other countries. It's part of an, mostly false narrative that the Communist Party has developed to explain some of recent history. And it's a similar thing. It's for us too. They want us to feel strong in the similar way Russia, which has deep challenges as well, doesn't want to look weak because it feels like people might punk it, basically. China has a bit of a similar thing, but so much of it is internal. It's remarkable, really, when a country's talking to itself so much, but it's kind of some of the reason it can seem so out of touch with what other people are trying. When we say things about China, like, does it know what it's doing? Does it know how crazy it looks or how crazy it sounds? But it has a different audience in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's true. And they have such a deep control of the media that the citizens can consume that they can definitely have an impact on everything that people think and believe.
Yeah, I think it was really supercharged. Everything they were doing with domestic propaganda was supercharged by the ability they found, really, since let's say 2008, to control thought and discourse and speech and imagery and everything. It's remarkable. It's one of the things that is really stabilizing the China. I know this sounds awful to American ears, and I bring up the individualist because collectivist because a lot of things I'll say that sent from the perspective of China is good to keep it integrated, not to collapse into violence and chaos. But to all of us, it was like, well, that's brutally barbaric. And I can't believe you even just said that with that tone, just for people to keep in mind. But yeah, the ability to monitor and control and stimulate and repress and grow whatever you want on the internet and sort of try and tamp down everything else is really important. And what China's actually doing on a deeper level, it's lowering almost like the per capita cost of maintaining that security that I was talking about, that unity. If you can do it digitally, if you can do it through algorithms, you're lowering the cost. You don't have to spend all the money we were talking about, ideally. because it's insanely expensive. And that's kind of what they're doing. And it's expanding in very creepy, very, 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 very creepy ways. The amount of data, what they're using it for, the way they're trying to incentivize certain micro behaviors for people to try and turn them into model good citizens. Then again, always in a sort of collectivist model of what is good for you is what's good for the state, is what maintains stability, is what allows you to continue doing what you're doing, which is kind of feedback, sort of that feedback in that way.
To us in the United States, it seems almost to a level of science fiction, the amount of monitoring that they do of their citizens and the way in which, as you said, they're incentivizing certain types of behavior.
Yeah, it's very dystopian in a lot of ways. To our eyes, it's very dystopian. But what I always like to tell people is just remember when we went around smashing Middle Eastern countries and South Asian countries, or way back in the day, we went there expecting things to change and thinking we knew what was best for the world and we knew how everything worked and where the future was going. But a lot of countries are what they are, and you have to understand them on their own terms. And it's horrible, but it also, what I always actually think about is the 1500s, sort of, this is the era of like Michel de Montaigne, the essayist, the French essayist, and then Shakespeare, just for American ears. It's like these guys were, I think it was Montaigne who had on the roof of his home, he had a quote from some Roman order that basically said, "Nothing that is human is foreign to me." And it was very much a skeptical but humanist mindset that really helps to, again, see these peoples and cultures and states on their own terms. And maybe, of course, we want them to evolve maybe in ways that seem more humane to us, but we first have to understand them as they are and why they're that way. Otherwise, we try and change places like Afghanistan, which we're never going to change. And we've reverted to exactly where it was 20 years ago.
I want to talk to you a little bit about food scarcity, because that was an issue that you had on your informative website. And you said that you believe that food scarcity will be an issue for China. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that came about?
Sure. So one of the interesting things about China is that its population, if we do a graph of China's population over time, there's all these ups and downs. There's all these booms and busts, because historically, Chinese food production has been very volatile. So it's very large. So that's why you get the large Chinese population. But there's all these booms and busts. And it's stabilized since the 1500s. This is when you got a lot of the Colombian, basically American, really there's the whole Colombian exchange. The crops from the Americas went to Europe. They also went to, both of them went to China. And that you got yams, potatoes, all these things that really expanded and stabilized Chinese production, food production. And that actually is what gave it such an enormous population when we're looking at the modern world, and also destabilized the Qing dynasty because it was so many people that they didn't quite know how to manage it. It's sort of similar things that happened in Europe in the 1800s as well. And I'm always wary of talking about food scarcity because everyone's always been saying the famines are coming back, right? There's been in the 1880s and the 1910s. They're always saying there's famines coming. The world's too many people. In the 1970s, I think it was Paul Ehrlich in the population bomb. This has been going on for a very long time. And innovation has really improved so many things that we've really been able to outstretch this for a long time. However, China is very different. China has had, on average, a famine every other year for 2,000 years. And it's gotten worse over the last 1,000 years. And the structure of the Chinese agricultural system is I go into it on the article you said, I go into a lot of detail about the various factors and how it's structured. And there's big problems because basically the only way that China increased its food production to feed 1.2 whatever million people, because the number is probably a lie. Also, the actual official Chinese population hasn't been reliable for probably 15 years now. But all of the increase in production came from fertilizers, and it came from doing things to the land that are very difficult. So as China has been basically developing, it's also been paving over its best farmland. It's basically the way China is structured geographically, it's as if the Midwest in the United States was right below or right on, the New York and the whole Boston, Washington region was on top of the Midwest. That's one way to think about it. They're on top of each other. So as you expanded all these cities, you actually ate into the farmland that was needed to feed people. So it's very important. And there are many things China could do to improve this, but there's just so many challenges. There's the age of, remember, so it's 1.28 million people or something, billion people. And you need farmers, but Chinese farmland is also not like the United States. So our Midwest, just to use the Midwest, the main region, it's very flat, very open. There's rivers everywhere, and you can just farm extensively all across the land. And you can do that with big mechanized equipment that really lowers the cost, and you can do all that. In China, it's much more hilly outcroppings. Like 67% of China is hilly or mountainous. And so it's farmland. So that when you look at China, you see pictures of a lot of Asian agriculture will be rice paddies on hills. They're like sliding down the hills. It looks very beautiful, very sort of pastoral in a way and beautiful. But that is not what anyone wants to do when you're farming. You don't want to have to be climbing down a hillside to do this. And it's actually a sign that you're moving agriculture into more marginal regions, more difficult regions for production. And these are regions that don't actually accept technological improvements the way that like the US. So it's like, oh, let's have giant tractors that have digital eyes and they squirt every little plant. Like you can do all these things if it's flat, if it's normal. The only place that's really like that in China is what used to be called Manchuria, sort of northeast China, but it's more in the north. It's similar to like Canada sort of latitudes. It's not the same kind of land. There's a lot of challenges. And the Chinese labor force is also aging, as everyone knows. So some of the oldest people are farmers. So the farmers' children moved to the cities and they, went to Shanghai, went to all these cities, and the farmers were left there. And they use, in China, the old farmers use small hand tools, and they have some of the smallest acre like farm sizes anywhere on earth. And you have about something like 280 million of them, 300, relatively close to the US population. That's how many farmers are required to farm China's land using these fertilizers on these small farms with very limited tools and to reach the amount of food they need. So that is already a precarious sort of thing, right? So as these farmers age out, they get sick, they get old, they die. There's no new generation. People do not want to move back to the farms. I mean, this was the story of modernization. So there's a lot of deep challenges. I could really go on about it for a while, but I always encourage people to don't forget food. Agriculture is why this whole world we have. That's why we have so many people. That's why we have these cities. That's why we have urban life. It's very important. And the Chinese, agricultural system is I think the metaphor I used, I don't know if I used it in that article, it's kind of like one of those old cars that's really like belching gas, and like you feel like anything could, it's whirring around and it feels like something could pop out and the whole thing will collapse. There's a similar vibe, I guess you could say, with Chinese agriculture. There's possibly a lot of things that could do better, but even pushing out improvements to such a large number of people across it's very difficult. There are many problems in the US with all these consolidated agriculture and all these problems. But again, if it's a question of like improving sort of industrial agriculture, adding more chemicals, which is not what I'm kidding, but just as an example, you can actually do it. Trying to get improvements, it's been an enormous challenge since the 90s just to get farmers to do some of the basic things that the government wants to do. Because how do you go? You don't even have enough people to impose it. Like the whole Communist Party is like 95 million. You literally don't even have enough people to try and do the farmers, and you have to do things with the energy system. There's all these different problems. In general, I'd say that the challenge for the Communist Party is managing all of these systems and these sort of large precarious systems all at once. So the agriculture system, consumer market, the energy sector, and the transportation sector, all of these things, it's sort of the major trade zones, all of these sort of need to be upgraded all at once. And in terms of capital, sort of the available capital in the country, they've really used it. Like China for a while, it felt like, oh my God, they have infinite money. They're just building everything everywhere. It's like, yeah, but then you built over 600 major cities. You built more ports than anyone ever needs. Now if you need to do a similar transformation of your industry, of the energy sector, it's enormously expensive. And it's going to be, it's basically impossible to do all of it at once, especially if the government has to try and manage and force all these transitions all at once. Very difficult. And agriculture often gets forgotten, which is a big reason why I sort of wrote that, to give people a sense of like, what the base, they call it the primary sector for a reason. It's like it's primary sector. And if that bad things happen there, you don't escape very easily.
Right. We need food. You also mentioned that you believe China has an energy dilemma. Did you want to touch on that as well?
Yeah. So basically it was in the late 90s, early 2000s when China realized, oh my God, I think it was Hu Jintao who said that he called it the Malacca dilemma, which is we don't have the energy resources we need within China to basically feed this massive industrial machine we're building. And so now in 2021, China uses about 50% more energy than the United States. So if you want to change the system, that's a lot. Like we're all very excited about renewable energy and all this, but if you want to add renewable energy, like to make a big dent in China, it's like, that's a lot of solar panels. And like it's enormous amounts, 50% more than the United States, and it's growing. So it's still growing. It's a huge problem. And all the energy resources that China really uses, which is basically hydrocarbons, natural gas, coal, and oil, and those ones, those main ones, it doesn't get in China. The only one it has is coal. And coal really fueled the Chinese boom. The whole modernization, its whole story was fueled on coal because it has a bunch of it all around the North China Plain in northern China. And it could use that to have a very reliable, local, and cheap source of fuel for all of its industry. Now there's huge problems. Every year, China, basically, I think over 50% of new coal on Earth is put in every year by China, and over 50% of all coal on Earth is used in China. It's an enormous thing. And the reason it's still doing it is because it's the one thing it really has locally and domestically, and it's cheap. Obviously, not the environmental costs, but like the actual electricity costs are cheap. Anytime you go beyond coal or some of the renewables, which are really like hydro is really tapped out in China. Nuclear is a huge thing. That's actually the best opportunity for China would be nuclear energy, but you can't really go crazy on that because you might get a Fukushima, you might do all these things. It's tough. It's very capital intensive, and nuclear energy is very regulatory, a lot of regulatory overhead. The main ones, it just needs to import oil and natural gas, and it's been a dilemma for 20 years. China is dependent on other countries for this, and it's tormented the Chinese leadership because one thing, for example, that requires a lot of oil and natural gas is war. If you get into war, like the United States, again, we have such a bad context for what the world is really like, because the United States will go invade random countries in other parts of the world, and it will somehow fuel its operations and do all the logistics, and we don't see any rise in fuel prices, we don't see a rise in interest rates. It's all very bizarre. But in normal countries, more normal countries like China, just trying to go to war over Taiwan could blacken the entire energy sector in China. If you can't get those resources, if you have huge premiums that start getting pulled, it's a really bad thing. So China is desperate to figure out what to do, and there is no answer yet. So that article that I wrote is basically trying to say through 2030, we're not looking at a massive transformation of the Chinese energy sector just because of the scale problem. This is always what makes it a challenge for China, both to understand China and for China to solve its own problems. It's always scale. The agriculture sector, it's so big. Oh my God, 300 million people. How do we do that for farmers? The energy sector, 50% bigger than the entire US energy sector. You're like, it's the scale of all these. And so you can't do it. So the same reason China couldn't, the whole world export market for agricultural products couldn't help it if it couldn't grow its own food enough of it. And it's the same thing with energy. You just don't even have, there's suddenly huge premiums. Everyone starts needing energy. China's pretty far away from the Middle East, and you have to go through all these countries. So that's a big reason why it has all these things, all these islands, all these conflicts in the South China Sea. It's moving it closer and closer to the Strait of Malacca, and also to hydrocarbon resources, offshore ones in the South China Sea. But this is very much a strategic thing, and it's really related to energy. And so we always have to understand that. I mean, the United States in 2005, when we were basically less dependent than China, but very dependent on foreign oil and foreign hydrocarbons. Remember our government. We were very concerned with Iraq. We were very concerned. There's Dick Cheney who worked at, Halliburton and all this. There is something to, obviously we did terrible things, but energy is everything. Agriculture is really just energy. It's energy that we take from plants and we use to, fund our, fuel our bodies. And the whole world that we know runs on energy. So energy is, like I was saying with agriculture, is another extremely important system. And so for people who are interested, the way I kind of operate is I go sort of system by system to look at these things, to try and give us the context, because it's one of the only ways to get the proper lenses on something as large and multifaceted, multidimensional as China, and kind of how it interrelates with the rest of the global economy.
So where is China headed? Why do you believe it's going to unravel?
Yeah, it's mainly all of these challenges are greater than any that it's faced really since the formation of the People's Republic of China. The whole breakdown in particular of its relationship with the United States, which is what enabled, and by extension for the rest of the world, is what enabled all of this to happen. You couldn't get the fertilizers, you couldn't get the various components, you couldn't move up the value chain, and sort of all sorts of consumer electronics. You couldn't really do all this if you didn't have access to global capital and global consumer markets. And we're seeing demographic transitions in Europe and in the United States. And we're seeing soured relations with China and basically the entire rest of the world, all of its neighbors. It's very difficult to sustain a country that runs on imported everything from all over the world. China, we still think of China as this grand exporter, but China actually is now an imports more than an exports. Started in 2017, where basically keep sustaining everything it's built now requires, kind of like the United States, all of these imports from everywhere, all across the world, for a huge swath of minerals and resources and metals and everything. It's commodities. It's everywhere. And it's one of those stories that's sort of buried, but China is deeply dependent on everything in the world continuing to function, continuing to allow it to function the way it has. And we're just seeing so many blowbacks, particularly in the United States. We had Trump and the 2016 election. We had the trade wars. We had an increase. At this point, we have almost bipartisan antagonism to China in the United States. It's basically bipartisan. In fact, the Democrats and the Republicans are like fighting to see who can be more bad to China, or at least Democrats are unwilling to seem weak on China, is maybe a better way to say it, because of how brutal that was during the 2016, in the years after that with Trump, where he was very successful in the sort of rhetorical world of blaming things on China. Yeah, and we're just seeing, Biden is more economically nationalist than Trump was. And just in terms of the actual policy, not what anyone's saying. He's blacklisting Chinese companies. It looks like there's going to be all sorts of financial regulations, listings that are going to be more difficult. And at the same time, so we have all this stuff, the challenges outside of China. And now we have the typical pattern that happens in Chinese history is you have this moment of openness in a state. So like the early Tang dynasty, that's an example, parts of the Song dynasty, early on the Han dynasty, you have all these periods when, let's let in all these new ideas and all these new people, new ideas, new businesses, new energy, new everything. But these, and obviously since 1979, that was what the whole reform and opening up period was. Then towards the end, you start to have a problem where all of these new energies and forces, they stimulate all of those chaotic forces that are moving around in China at all times, like I was mentioning, and the state tries to tamp them down. And what you see, again, end of the Tang dynasty, you see the entire Ming dynasty, you see the Qing, these states are forced to clamp down again. And we're seeing that in China. It's cracking down on its tech sector. It's cracking down on every form of entertainment, on celebrities, on video games. It goes across everything. And this is the period when you need the innovation to upgrade all of those systems that we're talking about. You need massive, massive innovation. You need the freedom to try things. And instead, what we're seeing is the Chinese state is closing ranks. And to me, what I actually see is it's a bit of an ambivalence, but it's always projecting the sense that there's a greatness as we're here and we've arrived. We're the once and future celestial kingdom has returned. But then you look at the actual policies and you look at the fear and the desperation that I see involved. It really looks like wide swaths of the elite do not think that things are going to work out. And you see that even with the business elite in China. I mean, there's been $1 trillion of capital flight out of China since 2016. Every year, not total. That's every year. We haven't seen that since the fall of the Soviet Union. There's nothing like that. Anyone with money in China is trying to get it out, and the Chinese government is doing everything possible to keep all that money and all the people and all the ideas and everything in China. Even now, they have new data laws. Any data produced in China cannot leave China. So this is the sort of clamping down at the moment when it needs to be able to reconfigure and evolve. And the Chinese state, the Communist Party, for all of its problems, has been very good at evolving with the times since 1979. And now it very much looks like it is losing some of that flexibility. It's evolving. It now thinks it's its own place and it can do its own things, but we're going to probably see really strong and painful limits to what it can really accomplish on that.
So what's ahead for you? What types of projects are you working on? I know you have a book that you're getting ready to put out and you have a podcast. Tell us a little bit about those projects.
Yeah, sure. So I have a great podcast. So China Unraveled podcast. Basically, I'd finished the first draft of the book in January of 2020. And then it was February, I was editing away. And basically COVID hit and I was like, I should take nuggets from this and give it to the world and make it useful and accessible and topical. And so I've been doing that on the podcast and people like it. And I'm going to keep doing it. I'm trying to find a nice style for it that is manageable with all the other things I'm doing, but it's going to have another episode coming out probably within the next month. So there's a podcast. I'm editing the book. And I'm hopefully that should come out the first part of next year, which is exciting. So it gives the full story of all these things I'm talking about. So when I'm randomly talking about the Tang dynasty and this and that, people can actually see, okay, maybe he actually does know about that. He's not just like randomly throwing it out. But that's really cool. And that's important because it gives the context it helps. I mean, the big push behind all this is to help the United States in particular understand more of itself and where it's going. Because we're a country that we're like a very competitive teenager who needs the rival to really gun himself up to perform at his best. And it's very helpful once the China story fails, which is what I think is going to happen. You're suddenly left with yourself. It's sort of like the person who travels and realizes, here I am, I'm still me. There's something to that effect that I think is valuable. I'm also trying to create a course, which ideally would be, anyone who listens to this would probably be free at that point. But I want to give some of the tools to understand, again, these countries, like why they are the way they are, how the politics, the economics, the culture, the military challenges, the geography, how that comes together to produce these countries in a way that helps people understand them, as opposed to telling them what social system should be imposed, what economic system is the best, what political virtues and systems are the only ones that anyone should allow. It's sort of just to actually understand it. So there's those. Yeah, the podcast, the book, doing these interviews to try and get people to get some of the better information out so you don't get swamped with it. I think those are the main three. I got other things that are sort of cooking, but this is definitely the sort of China related stuff that anyone who listened to me talk here would probably be interested in some of those things.
And where can listeners find out more about you?
Sure. Yeah, I have a website. I got a couple of articles and things up there. I'm also writing some articles in general for other publications, so those will also be on the website. So that's www.jasonszeftel, Szeftel, which is SZEFTEL.com. You can also find me on Twitter. It's also, I think it's Jason Szeftel too. And that's fun. I don't use it much, but I like to throw out random articles and give sort of profound sounding little one-liners alongside them. That's probably a really good place to look at me. Also on YouTube, I sort of do quick 30-minute sort of live streams where I just basically mouth off about certain topics about China. I'm not yet at the point where I just mouth off in general about nothing. But maybe if people follow, maybe I'll actually be at that point. No, but I talk about China and so it's really fun. I talk about trying to create a Beijing stock exchange, all these quick things. I go on a sort of very in-depth rant about little things. Those are useful. And I want to also create more videos and stuff once I have some of the writing is not consuming my brain and my soul as much. More video will definitely come on there. So yeah, the YouTube, I think it's just Jason Szeftel as well. And that's probably the best place. I'd say if anyone is really interested, you can also email me, j.szeftel@gmail.com. But Twitter is probably the best place because I'm always wanting to talk to people on there, but I don't actually go on enough. So you definitely get my attention.
So definitely check out Jason's website. He has a lot of interesting articles on there. And also you can listen to his podcast through his website. It was great to have you on the show, Jason. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thanks, Karen. It was great.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. How many time zones does China have? Despite its large size, China only has one official time zone. Although it geographically spans 5 time zones, everyone in China uses official Beijing time. We'll end the show with something punny. What color socks do pandas wear? Pandas don't wear socks, they have bare feet. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.